Thank you, Peggy, and welcome everyone. It is always a joy and a pleasure to be here sharing some of these ideas, concerns, experiences with all of you. This is probably going to be the most difficult talk for the not so esoteric reason that you just had lunch. So it will be hard to keep your awareness down, but I'll do my best. As Peggy said, the title is The Spiritual Ascent from Selfishness to Illumination. And the idea with the talk is to present a kind of map of consciousness, a ladder of different states of consciousness that all aspirants go through, and look a little at how we can go from one state to the other. So I think in this regard, sometimes when people come to the Theosophical teachings, they find them complex. And obviously at the beginning, that is something that is difficult or makes it difficult for people to maybe continue with the teachings. But the level of detail is very important for the practice. What I have found is that when we are giving a practice without the foundation, sometimes it's hard for us to continue with that practice. But when there is a deep understanding of why exactly are you doing this and where are you going and how is this working, that supports the practice. So that's the intention with this talk, to show you some of that. So let's see first, we are going to look into the connection between spirituality and social change. I'll give you some quotes. This is one from The Voice of the Silence, a book that Blavatsky wrote. She said, or the book says, "Believe thou not that sitting in dark forests, in proud seclusion and apart from men, believe thou not, O devotee, that this will lead thee to the goal of final liberation. Think not that when the sins of thy gross form are conquered, thy duties accomplished by nature and by men, the blessed ones have scorned to do so." So you see, in many spiritual traditions, if you are serious, then you are supposed to leave the world, go to a monastery, the forest, the desert, the mountain. That's what a serious spiritual person does in many traditions. Now, the Theosophical tradition was never about that. On the contrary, there is a strong criticism to that approach, sometimes a little unfair, but there is a strong criticism to people who leave the world in order to be spiritual. Because the idea is that we are trying to be spiritual, not to attain our own heaven, liberation, etc., but to help others. And therefore, you can take some time for your inner work like the Buddha did. He left the world, then he got his enlightenment, and he came back to the world. And of course, in your journey as a soul, there may be incarnations in which you are more focused on the inner development. But the overall idea is that spiritual development is for the world, not for yourself, because we are not separate from the world, as we already discussed today, and we are going to see in some of the quotes. So then there is, this quote continues saying, "The Lord of Mercy," the Buddha, "perceiving the true cause of human woe, immediately forsook the sweet but selfish rest of quiet wilds. For Aranyaka," which is the hermit, from Aranyaka, he became the teacher of mankind. To live to benefit mankind is the first step. To practice the 6 glorious virtues is the second. You see, that's a very interesting statement at the end, because the idea, the 6 glorious virtues are the paramitas in Buddhism. And here he's saying, the first step is your intention to benefit humanity. Then your spiritual practice is secondary. The first motivation is helping humanity. So this represents very well the theosophical spirit of how to approach spirituality. And Besant said, for example, the rapture of the mystic in the beatific vision does not really work out its due results unless he brings some of the beauty and the harmony which have delighted him into the jungle and the noises of our earthly life. That keen air of the mountains, delicious as it is, should not incapacitate us, but rather invigorate us for the meeting of human troubles, for the healing of human woes. So this is also metaphorical, from one point of view, Besant is saying the same as the voice of the silence, but also as we become more spiritual, we begin to be more attracted to peace and harmony, etc. And there can be that kind of selfish tendency to retreat to our own little world in which everything is fine. Now, Besant says the full result, the full effect of an enlightened mind can come into being only when we bring that into the world. Because it's easy enough to be spiritual when we are not facing difficulties, but more than that, as we were saying, if we are not participating in the world, then we are refraining from sharing those things that we may have obtained or attained. So this is, there is always it's like similar to the idea of meditation and daily living. If you just meditate and leave on your cushion any inspiration, insight, or peace that you may have attained, and go to the world and you just become or act in the same way as you always do, then what's the purpose of the meditation? We need to make an effort to bring that state of consciousness into our daily life. And this is the same, on a larger scale. So let's look to the question of how the inner transformation, apart from any external action, how the inner transformation can help humanity. So this is a quote I always bring when talking about this from Blavatsky. I love this quote. She says, to seek to achieve political reforms, which is, we all think we need to produce reforms in our systems, political, social, religious. Now she says, to seek to achieve these reforms, before we have effected a reform in human nature, is like putting new wine into old bottles. And this is a problem we normally have. I mean, how many systems we have changed in human history? And we have the times of the kings and the feudal lords, and we have democracy, and we have communism, and somehow we always end up more or less in the same place, with an elite having most of the resources, most of the people who are doing the work so that the elite can have the resources. So it's not a question, of course there are systems that are better than others, but if we use any system with a selfish intent, we are going to end up in the same way, in the same place. So she says, make men, of course men and women, this was written in late 19th century, make men feel and recognize in the innermost hearts what is their real, true duty to all men, and every old abuse of power, every iniquitous law in the national policy based on human, social, or political selfishness will disappear of itself. And she finishes, no lasting political reform can be ever achieved with the same selfish men at the head of affairs as of old. So this is not saying we should not be working at the level of external reform, but that is not the only field that we need to be working on, and it's not going to last if we are not working on the inner revolution. And organizations like the Theosophical Society were founded to bring this challenge to humanity, the inner revolution, along with the external reform that may be necessary. And as Jeffrey Hodgson says, let me read the quote first, "A mighty power which no one can evade rules the universe. It is the power of immutable law." So this is an immutable law, what he's going to say. "For the reaping is always exactly proportionate to the sowing. So perfect is the law. Cruelty begets cruel pain. Kindness and mercy beget happiness and freedom from pain." So when we are trying to solve our problems, if we try to solve the problems through cruelty, we are going to generate future cruelty. That is the problem that is hard for us to understand as humanity. We have a problem, and we may be right, in the right position, on the right side. Of course, everybody thinks is on the right side, so that's a problem in itself. But even if we are, if we use cruelty to achieve our aims, we may succeed in that particular endeavor, but we are generating the continuance of cruelty. This is why the Buddha, Jesus, they said, hate cannot cease through hate, only through love. And this is the challenge for us, because how do we deal with in our lives, in the world, with the situations where people may be violent, may be aggressive? How do we deal with these situations without incurring in cruelty, without incurring in separation? Because again, the short side may say, let us overpower them, whether it is a country that is behaving in a way that we think is wrong, or a group of people, or a person in our lives. Maybe we have the power, we can override whatever they are doing, and we may think we won, but we are perpetuating cruelty if we use the wrong means. So he says, is it not also perfectly plain that immediate preventive action is needed if this cycle of cause, effect, and continuing cause is to be cut? We need to prevent. We need to work on changing our consciousness before the conflict is there. Of course, there is always conflict, but if we work on changing the consciousness of humanity now, we may not be able to prevent the immediate conflict, but we are generating a future free of conflict. And then the reason for this, as we discussed this morning, as William and Kim pointed out, the reason for this is that we are not really separate. So Blavatsky says, only the weakening of the feeling of separateness can help the world. And such a weakening can only be achieved by a process of inner enlightenment. Unfortunately, this cannot be imposed on people. It cannot be imposed on ourselves. It cannot be imposed on others. We ourselves, if we want to help the world, we have to be actively working on weakening the sense of separation. So when we see the other side doing something that we think that is wrong, how do we relate to that without strengthening the sense of separation? This doesn't mean to have that feeble and kind of weak feeling of everything is fine, all is good, No, you can have discernment, and you can say, these actions lead to more suffering. These actions are not going to solve that problem. But the inner attitude is what matters. Are you saying this and coming from a place of hate, from a place of separation, from a place of judgment and diminishing the other? Or can you hold a compassionate view, understanding that people are suffering, and sure, they may have the wrong answer, assuming that you have the right one, which again, we should question that. But even if we do, the other person may be having the wrong answer, but can you see that person is simply responding to suffering to the conditioning in their environment as we are conditioned in our environment, and they are trying to do the best they can. You may not approve, you may not agree with that line of action, but can you feel love and compassion for the person, the country, the group of people in general? So it is not violence that can ever ensure bread and comfort for all, nor is the kingdom of peace and love, of mutual help and charity and food for all, to be conquered by a cold, reasoning, diplomatic policy. It is only by the close brotherly union of men's inner selves, of soul solidarity, that the reign of justice and equality for all can ever be inaugurated. This is the first of the three fundamental objects for which the Theosophical Society was established. So this is our work as Theosophists. Then we can also work in social, reform, in activism, in helping people on different levels with food, shelter. We are not just members of the society, we are human beings. So there are many fields in which we can help. Now, as members of the society, this is the particular way that the Theosophical Society chose to help humanity. And of course, we have the Theosophical Order of Service that is more focused on helping also on more of the physical plane, let's say. And where Blavatsky says, the interdependence of humanity affords the solution to the great question of collective suffering and its relief. It is an occult law, moreover, that no man can rise superior to his individual failings without lifting, be it ever so little, the whole body of which he is an integral part. In the same way, no one can sin, nor suffer the effects of sin alone. In reality, there is no such thing as separateness. So we may like to isolate the people that we think are not nice people, or the countries that we think are misbehaving, or the political followers that we think are not doing the right thing. We may try to isolate them, but that may be possible, relatively speaking, on the physical plane. It's impossible at the level of consciousness. We cannot separate ourselves from others. We are, whether we like it or not, we are all together on this boat. And that is actually how we can help, because our own transformation is helping to transform the consciousness of the whole humanity. And this is the true incentive for the spiritual practice. When you are kind of sleepy and you say, I don't want to meditate, or when you are, whatever may be difficult to do, if you bring to mind you are working to transform the human consciousness, you will get inspiration. Because if we are doing this spiritual thing for ourselves, we are doing it because we want to feel better. So the moment that the spiritual practice does not make you feel better, then the motivation is off, is out, because you are doing it to feel better. If it doesn't make me feel better, then I'll drop it. But if you are doing it for something far bigger, the transformation of humanity, that will give you the inspiration to persevere in whatever circumstances you are going through in your life. So that's the introduction. Let's see now the ladder of consciousness. So in the next slide, let me show you really briefly about the human constitution. So we have first, we all are aware of the body, our dimension, physical dimension. Then in the next one, we see the spiritual aspect. Now in the Theosophical tradition, these are of such a different nature that they don't really meet. So they need a third principle in the next one, which is what we call soul. The soul is like the bridge between the spirit and the body. And the soul interacts with both spirit and body. So what we are going to see now is the basic quality, or one of the basic qualities of the soul, is what in Theosophy we call manas, which is the mind. Now, when the mind is interacting with the body, we have this principle that we call kama, the desire nature. And when the mind is interacting with the spirit, we have buddhi, that is what we call spiritual wisdom. So these are the main components of the soul, and we are going to see that evolution implies moving from the desire nature to the spiritual wisdom. I mean, there is more beyond that, but this is where we are going to focus tonight. That is our immediate goal. So we are going to focus on the soul, on the different levels of the soul. That manas has two aspects, what we call higher manas and lower manas. I'm giving you now the map that I was talking about, and you will see how this is necessary for the practice. So let us call the lower manas is the concrete mind, the aspect of the mind that is working through the body, through the brain, the one that is limited by the senses, the one we use in everyday life. But there is a higher aspect of the mind, higher manas, that let us call it the abstract mind. I'm going to avoid the technical terms, but let me present it like this first. So this is the higher manas is like the mind of the soul. Now, the higher manas, the abstract mind, is always aspiring toward buddhi, which is the spiritual wisdom. But the lower, the concrete mind, is always being dragged, or normally at this point in evolution, toward kama, which is the desire nature. So you see, you feel this tendency within you. There is an aspect of yourself that wants to go along with the desires, with pleasure, with feeling good, but there is another aspect of yourself that is aspiring to something more. And that's the basic duality that was mentioned this morning. Now, let us look then into, because all these different states can be broken up, so to say, in sub-states. So when the lower manas interacts with the desire nature, we have what in Theosophy we call the kama manas, which is the desire mind. The desire mind is the mind that is driven by desire. So kama is the desire nature. Kama manas is the desire mind when as I said, the mind is driven by desires. Now, when the lower manas aspires to the higher, to the spiritual nature, there is a state that Blavatsky called manas antahkarana. Antahkarana is a Sanskrit word that means the inner organ. And that is the aspiring mind, we will see, because this comes into being when your mind is aspiring for something higher. And then when the higher nature is always trying to impress our soul. So buddhi is trying to throw its wisdom on the higher mind. So when that happens, we have what Blavatsky called manas taijasa. Taijasa means brilliant. So that is the illumined mind, the mind that is illumined by the spiritual wisdom. And then finally you have buddhi manas, which is when the mind is definitely united to the spiritual wisdom, and that is the wisdom mind, that is the enlightened mind. So basically here, we are going to look at this more closely, but basically here you have the ladder of consciousness moving from kama to buddhi. So let's look now to the spiritual ascent. We will start, how do we go from the desire mind to the concrete mind? Because that's the first step, the first thing that we need to stimulate in ourselves. Of course, if we are here, we have done this to a large extent, but this is not something that you do is on and off, you do it once and that's it. Actually, there is our consciousness may be mostly here, then some here, sometimes here, and in the different levels. And as we proceed with our evolution, then what happens is that the lower levels are less and less meaningful, less and less powerful. So let's see the first step. The desire mind, a little definition. Besant said consciousness is seated in the second level, and this is the case with higher animals and with large classes of people. Our pets are already developing a kind of desire mind. We all know they show an intelligence, even though they don't have full self-consciousness, as Kim was saying. They are beginning to develop a mind which is driven by desire. Now, many people are still at that level, not obviously at the level of the pets because their minds are fully developed, but still their desires are the main thing that drives their worldview, their actions. You know how they say in political discourse, you can never convince somebody by presenting an argument, presenting, facts. Because the mind that is acting is the desire mind. It's not the intellectual mind that we are going to see next. This happens in religion very often. A person may have a belief or a position that is driven by the emotions, by the desires. So no intellectual argument is going to convince them because that's not the mind that is operating. And this is the desire mind, which many times we act from that level also. Now we need to the first step is begin by stimulating the concrete mind. Besant says the lower mind, this is also called the lower mind or lower manas, the lower mind can express a certain kind of vibration of consciousness. This we call reason, judgment, imagination, comparison, and the other mental faculties. Its thoughts are concrete, and its method is logic. It argues, it reasons, it infers. So these are the qualities of the concrete mind. And although from a spiritual point of view this is limited, it is a step that is necessary. So people can move. This is what we try to do, perhaps with some relatives, trying to help them see certain things in a more logical way rather than from the point of view of superstition or just theories that are not based on fact. So how do you move from the desire mind to the concrete mind? By using this, reason, judgment, imagination, etc. Now, we have the exponents of this mind would be like, let's say, like the scientists or philosophers or people who work with their minds. And many times we see in them the shadow aspect of this mind. So the Ascent, the idea is to purify and elevate desire and stimulate the concrete mind by logical thinking, intellectual knowledge, and detached observation. So the purification of desires is also necessary because when the desire is too strong, our thinking is not clear. Now this has a shadow, the development of this mind, that is materialism, arrogance, lack of empathy and emotions, apathy, cynicism. We can see in people who are just intellectual, they can be any of these things. However, developing this is necessary to move away from the desire mind. During the workshop, we are going to see practices for each of these steps. Let's see now how to move from the concrete to the aspiring mind. So let me give you a definition first. The aspiring mind, remember Blavatsky used antahkarana. This mind is active only during those moments when the lower manas, the aspiring mind is still part of the lower mind, but it's the lower mind when it aspires towards something higher, towards its higher half, the higher mind, and thus becomes the medium of communication between the two. Such an aspiration would be a tendency towards theosophy or spiritual teachings. She was talking to theosophists. this instinct, if developed, becomes a conscious aspiration. This is what brings us, many religious people have an aspiration to the higher. It may not be very conscious, but they are attracted to it because there is some aspiration. When it becomes a conscious aspiration, it becomes the driving power of your life. So the ascent, you need to start stimulating a religious or spiritual interest, an attraction to an ethical life, a concern about the common good, engage in service and cultivation of virtues, while the concrete mind, you stimulate it by intellectual work. The aspiring mind, you stimulate it by higher emotions, by devotion, by worship, by aspiration, as we are saying. So this, of course, has also its shadow. It may lead to unpractical idealism or self-righteousness or lack of self-confidence, especially in a religious context where you aspire to the higher and the higher is so high that you feel small, and scruples, that is a thing in the Catholic Church where you always feel you are sinning, you are always sinning. Of course, this has the shadows, and it's important to know the shadow of all this so that we don't fall into those, and we can stimulate all this in a wholesome way. So then, how do we go from the aspiring mind to the abstract mind? Let us define briefly the abstract mind. This mind no longer dwells entirely on the mental images obtained from sensations, no longer reasons on purely concrete objects, nor is concerned with the attributes which differentiate one from another. It perceives some attribute which appears in a number of objects, otherwise dissimilar, and makes a link between them. So the idea with something, an abstract reality, is something that is not concrete. So for example, we have a beautiful person object, and that is a concrete object. This is beautiful. Now the idea of beauty, apart from any object, that's an abstract perception. Now, some people may be able to perceive beauty in some objects, but not necessarily beauty in a more abstract way. So they may see a sunset and may not be able to perceive any beauty there. Or in a flower, a forest, So the abstract mind is the one that can perceive realities that are not concrete and that are common to everybody. So if I discriminate between myself and another group of human beings, it's because I cannot perceive as a reality the abstract reality that we are just human beings. If I can see only people that look like me, speak like me, or believe what I believe, and I feel that they are mine, and the others that are different are not, that's because my mind can only see the concrete, cannot perceive the reality that we are all human beings. So the abstract mind is the one that perceives commonalities. It conceives of the common property as an idea, apart from all the objects in which it appears, and thus contracts a higher kind of mental image of a concrete object, the image of an idea that has no phenomenal existence in the worlds of form, but which exists on the higher levels of the mental plane. So as we were saying, humanity is not a concrete form that exists on the physical plane. You cannot point to humanity. But it is a reality on the higher mental planes, as again it was said this morning, that we are one being as humanity. So when these ideas resonate with you, that's because your higher mind is active enough in you to recognize the truth of that. Now that higher mind can be developed up to the point of enlightenment, as we are going to see. But evidently, if we are here, all these principles have been developed to some extent, and we can continue with that work and deepen our let's say, the awakening of these principles. So the Ascent, let me read a quote. It is very important for theosophists to find themselves at home amidst abstractions. We are so anxious to bring things down within the comprehension of the lower mind. If you will endeavor to meditate on these abstractions, rather than meditating always upon those things which are within your grasp, you assist opening a channel for the higher consciousness of which you are not yet aware. You see, sometimes people say, why would I study the secret doctrine or concepts that are abstract? Because that's how we stimulate the higher mind. Of course, we are not saying that's the only thing you should do, and then live in the higher mind, as we are going to see. This also has its own shadow. But we have the tendency to always dwell in what we can grasp. So give me the book that is more graspable. Well, that is perfectly fine, but if you are going to stimulate something in you that is in the process of awakening, then that will require effort. So when you deal with ideas that are hard and you feel the effort, don't get frustrated. Think of that as a spiritual gym. You are making an effort to develop a muscle, the abstract mind muscle. Another quote. How may the aspirant develop higher consciousness and intuition? The method which has been taught throughout the ages is that of meditation upon subjects which are normally beyond comprehension. Dwell upon concepts and expressions of universal principles. Meditation upon such sublime ideas lifts the aspirant out of the personal into the higher consciousness, where he touches for a moment that part of himself which is divine. So again, meditate on your spiritual nature, meditate on spiritual truths, on realities that are beyond the physical and psychological realms. So that's the idea. Stimulate abstract thinking, focus on commonalities rather than differences. That's also very important in daily life. Make an effort to see the commonality behind things. There are different beliefs, try to see the commonality. There are different people, try to see the commonality. There are different ideas, try to see the commonality. That's how you stimulate the higher mind. The lower mind is the one that chops everything apart and separates everything. We have that mind very trained, that aspect of the lower mind, and we can spot differences right away. But if we want to stimulate the higher mind, strive to see commonalities, even in, or not even, but most importantly, in things that seem to you very different, opposite, apart. What is the common thing in this situation, people, etc.? Next one. So the shadow, you know, there can be some people have like the abstract mind more developed than the lower mind, and then you have a kind of vagueness, difficulty to appreciate differences and to apply the principles. You know, that idea, oh, everything is one, and then there is a difficulty to discern among the many, because there is the one and there is the many. So some people may have a difficulty really getting things done or being productive in the world, or, you know, all that aspect. Also, it may produce some detachment and aloofness. Okay, I don't care. You know, the spiritual, the higher mind is eternal, so who cares? So those are some possible shadows of this development. And then we are going to look at the ascent from the higher, from the abstract mind to the illumined mind. Remember these two, the wisdom mind and the illumined mind. The wisdom mind is like when the illumined mind becomes a constant state. So normally, Blavatsky says the illumined mind operates when there is a contact between buddhi and manas, but that is temporary. Now, through the practice and the spiritual growth, at some point, buddhi and manas, the spiritual wisdom and the mind become merged. This is the marriage of the spirit and the soul, and then that would be the wisdom mind. So we are going to look at the illumined mind, because the wisdom mind is just a deepening of the same kind of work. So just a brief definition, there is a spiritual consciousness, Blavatsky says, the mind illumined by the light of buddhi, the spiritual wisdom, that which subjectively perceives abstractions. So for this mind, all the things that seem abstractions to us are real. So when we talk about the unity of life, for most people that is an abstraction. But the more this mind is active in you, the more real this becomes. And because it is real, it shapes your life. It shapes your actions, your outlook. At the beginning, all those abstract realities are a concept. And as a concept, they are great, but they don't have enough strength to shape our lives. But when the manastajasa, the higher mind illumined by buddhi, begins to be active in us, they become realities to us. And at that point, they start shaping your action. And then Blavatsky says, it is the human soul illuminated by the radiance of the divine soul, the human reason led by the light of the spirit, or divine self-consciousness. So our self-consciousness, there is self-consciousness on each of these levels that I described. So most of the seat of self-consciousness in most of us is at the level of the mind. We think the lower mind, the concrete mind. We think we are our thoughts, right? The thinker. Now, as we begin to activate these higher states of consciousness, our self-consciousness, we begin to be aware of us being the soul, us being the divine. So that becomes a reality to us also. We are the divine, so that's why it is the source of divine self-consciousness, not just the intellectual self-consciousness that most have. And the ascent here is where, let me read Hudson's quote first. The student passes progressively from concentrated thought to meditation, and from meditation to profound contemplation. So let me stop there briefly. In the theosophical approach to meditation, there are these three stages. Concentration of the mind, that's where you are gathering the concrete mind and focus its attention. Then meditation, you start meditating on higher realities to engage the abstract mind. And then contemplation, you leave behind any mental activity, because now you are trying to merge with buddhi, which is beyond the mind. So contemplation is a silent contemplation. So if you are going to stimulate the mind that is illumined by buddhi, you need to practice that silent contemplation, in which he says everything within him seems to stand still. He then dwells in utter silence upon the very essence of the idea which has been chosen. We'll see this more in detail in the workshop, but you are meditating on a spiritual aspect to stimulate your abstract mind, and at some point you leave all that behind and stay in silence in that high state of consciousness. Eventually, even that essence falls away and the soul is left in darkness and alone. In that silence, the voice of the divine is heard, and in the darkness, the light eternal shines. So another quote from Jinara Jadasa, he was an international president. Intuition is not the result of any process of mind. The mind knows by examination of an object from outside that object, but intuition knows by becoming one with the object. The knowledge which intuition obtains is by identification, by becoming one with it, not by analysis. So you see, it is important for these deeper states of consciousness to go beyond the mind. But the mind has to bring you up there, because today a lot of people think that meditation is sitting and trying to quiet your mind. And that's fine, but in the theosophical tradition, if you just quiet your mind without generating the aspiring mind. You know, I guess it's similar to what they say in Tibetan Buddhism, the generation of bodhicitta. You know, you start trying to stimulate the aspiring mind. Again, we will see this in the workshop. Then you stimulate the abstract mind by placing your mind on eternal truths. And then you can try to drop mental activity because you are placed on a higher state of consciousness. Otherwise, if you just quiet your mind with no preparation, there is the danger of generating passivity, generating what in Theosophy used to be called a mediumistic mind, a mind that is blank, open to any influence from the lower planes. And in that silence will arise within him the spiritual consciousness, responding to subtle thrillings from an unknown world, first feebly and then more strongly, with a courage ever increasing, that loftier consciousness answers. He knows himself as spirit, he knows himself divine, because it's on that level of consciousness that we realize our higher nature. So the practice is practice silent contemplation and encourage silence in your life, a state of silent awareness. At that point, this is the illumined mind, so I couldn't find, looking into it, any shadow. There may be some. Yes, there is a weakness in that state, weakness or whatever, that is temporary. So, but as you continue, then that becomes a permanent state, and that's an enlightened being, basically. Yeah. All right, that's it.